The NBA has a tanking problem. Tanking is the process by which general managers and front offices purposefully make their teams as bad as possible to lose games in order to get a higher spot in the draft. The reason this is possible is that the NBA, like all the other North American sports leagues, has, generally speaking, a reverse order draft, meaning the worst teams in the league get rewarded with the best picks, whereas the best teams in the league get the worst picks. Now, this concept makes sense in theory. If you want a competitive league with parity, where all 30 teams, even the small market teams, have a chance to win the NBA championship, then the reverse order draft is the way to do it. The bad teams need a way to improve, so giving them the best young players coming into the league makes sense, whereas the good teams don't need any more help, so they can pick later in the draft. The NBA doesn't want to end up like European soccer leagues, where a small handful of elite teams dominate year in and year out because they lure the best free agents and just outspend everyone else. But this sets up an impossible conundrum. If you want a fair and competitive league, you have to have a reverse order draft. But if you have a reverse order draft, teams are going to tank to get the best picks possible. It's unavoidable. Now, the league has gone to great lengths to mitigate tanking. Originally, teams were just put in reverse order, and that was that. The only exception back in the 1950s was something called territorial picks, which was a special claim teams could make on a player who came from their specific geographic region. For instance, Oscar Robertson was drafted by the Cincinnati Royals in 1960 with a territorial pick because he was attending the University of Cincinnati. That was an interesting concept, but it obviously had certain unfair ramifications, so it ended in 1965. Then, from 66 until 1984, the teams were still just in reverse order for the draft, except the last place teams in each conference flipped a coin to see who would get the number 1 pick and who would get number 2. But after the Houston Rockets won the 1984 coin flip and selected Akeem Olajuwon with the first pick, there was accusations that they and a few other teams were trying to lose games to secure the best pick possible. Where have I heard this before? So then, in 1985, the league introduced the lottery, which randomized the order of the non-playoff teams. Since '85, there has been numerous tweaks and changes to the system, all to make it more fair and to counteract tanking. It's a constant give and take though, as the NBA wants to improve fairness while also reducing the incentive to tank. The biggest change was in 1990 when the odds became weighted, meaning there was still a randomized order for the non-playoff teams, but the worst team's chances to get the best picks were the highest. This is more or less the system we still have in place today. They replaced envelopes with ping pong balls, but for all intents and purposes, it's still a lottery for the 14 non-playoff teams, with the worst of the worst getting the best odds at the top picks. Now, the reason why it's important to know the full history of the draft lottery is that one thing remains the same from the 80s until today. Bad teams are going to tank for better picks if the draft is in reverse order. Again, this is unavoidable. No matter how many times the league alters the percentages and tweaks the weighting, bad teams are still going to be incentivized to go ahead and be as bad as possible to increase their chances, whatever they may be, as much as they can. Because it's easy to tank. If you're already bad, what's a few more losses? If you're already bad, just trade away your best player. It's easy and it's proven to work. Granted, you can take it too far. The process in Philadelphia might have been the most obvious and egregious tanking experiment ever, but the general concept has been around for decades and will continue to exist as long as the reverse order draft system remains. So what can the NBA do? They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. They need the reverse order draft to keep the league competitive and fair, but a reverse order draft leads to tanking, which leads to terrible teams, which leads to a worse on-court product for the NBA. Now, there have been many proposed solutions over the years. Some would say just eliminate the reverse ordering entirely. That would certainly get rid of tanking if teams had no incentive to be bad, right? Well, that's definitely true, but getting rid of the reverse ordering entirely would be really unfair for certain teams and would pretty much enshrine a competitive disadvantage for a significant number of franchises. There have also been other, more out-of-the-box proposals as well. Mike Zarin's infamous draft wheel proposal suggested teams draft within a certain predetermined range every year, which cycles year by year for every team in the league. While this is certainly more fair and would probably eliminate a certain amount of tanking, it's still not entirely fair and would definitely lead to unintended consequences, like the best team in the league lucking into the best prospect in the draft, and I don't think anybody in the league wants that. So here's what the NBA should do. Enact a 3-tiered, randomized draft lottery. Sounds complicated, but it's really quite simple. Here's how it would work. There are 30 teams in the NBA. If you're one of the bottom 10 teams by the end of the season, then you are in the top tier of the draft. If you finish in the middle third of the league, then you are in the middle tier of the draft. And if you're one of the top 10 teams in the league, then you're in the bottom tier of the draft. Now, each tier is then totally randomized. The 10 teams with the worst records all have an equal 10% chance at the number 1 pick and at the number 2 pick, and so on until you get to pick number 10. Then, the middle tier teams are all randomized for picks 11 through 20, and finally, the best 10 teams in the league are randomized for picks 21 through 30. Ultimately, this is pretty similar to the current system, but with 2 key differences. First, the cutoff for that bottom tier would now be the bottom 10 teams rather than the bottom 14 teams like we currently have with the non-playoff teams in the draft lottery. This seems more fair because, honestly, if you're the 14th worst record, that means you're the 16th best team in the league. So, in other words, you're a mediocre team, you're middle of the pack. In my opinion, you are too good to be eligible for those top picks in the draft. But the bigger difference is the randomization of the picks within the tiers, eliminating the weighted odds for the worst teams. This is vital because it would for the most part eliminate tanking. Here's how. Teams would no longer have an incentive to be the worst of the worst. There would be no difference for your draft odds if you were in dead last, or if you were the 5th worst team, or if you were the 9th worst team. This is a crucial difference. Look, it's inevitable that in any sports league, certain teams on a year-by-year basis are going to be bad. Somebody's got to end up in last place. But with a reverse order lottery like the one we have now, teams want to increase their chances as much as possible. The way you do that is by being as bad as possible. You have to be worse than the other bad teams. But with a 3-tiered randomized system, that perverse incentive would be mostly eliminated. As long as you're in that bottom tier, it doesn't matter if you're 30th or 25th. Teams would be free to be, quote, respectably bad. You would no longer have to worry about shutting down your best player for the final couple of months of the season with mystery injuries like we've seen recently with the OKC Thunder and the Portland Trail Blazers. Now, granted, teams would still have an incentive to tank into the bottom 10, wouldn't they? Well, kind of, but now that we have the play-in tournament, and for all intents and purposes there are 10 postseason spots available in each conference, that might be less of an issue, as we've seen most of the teams that were on the periphery of the top 10 push pretty hard to make the play-in tournament, the Lakers notwithstanding. Even though the odds are stacked against you as the 9th or 10th seed, you still have a shot at the playoffs, like the Pelicans successfully demonstrated in 2022. And we have seen many times over that nothing can tempt competitive and impatient billionaire owners like the allure of the playoffs. So that leaves 5 teams at the bottom of each conference out of the play-in. And so if the conferences were equal, that would be the 10 teams in that top tier of the draft. So it kind of works perfectly with the current system. You are either bad, securely in the bottom tier, or you're fighting for the play-in game, which theoretically would incentivize you to win. Again though, there distinctly would not be an incentive amongst the bottom 10 teams to be worse than each other like there is now. Okay, so admittedly, the biggest drawback with a randomized 10-team tier would be the worst teams getting unlucky and missing out on a top pick. Let's say you are a terrible team and you have the worst record in the league, but you end up getting the 8th pick in the draft. That would certainly be an unfortunate outcome, but as it stands right now, your chances are definitely not guaranteed to get a great pick even if you suck. In the last 20 drafts, the worst team has only ended up with the number 1 pick 6 times. On the contrary, teams outside of the bottom 5 have lucked into the number 1 pick 6 times as well. In fact, the 9th worst team has gotten the number 1 pick twice in that span. That just goes to show that you could still get lucky or unlucky with the current system as well. But with the odds being even slightly better for the worst teams, you're still incentivized to be the worst of the worst, even though the odds aren't that great. In fact, with the current system, the bottom 4 teams only have a 14% chance at the number 1 pick. With this new proposal, those same teams would have a 10% chance at the number 1 pick. It's only a 4% difference in getting Victor Wembanyama, but it would totally eliminate the need to tank, because again, your chances of getting that number 1 pick would be the same in 30th as they would in 26th, as they would in 22nd. So as long as you were already bad and in that bottom tier, there would be no need to tank and be the worst of the worst. Let's look at an example, the aforementioned Oklahoma City Thunder. They've been tanking pretty aggressively over the past few seasons, perhaps harder than any other team in the league. 2 years ago, in the 2021 season, they ended up with the 4th worst record in the NBA, although they had the worst point differential by far. They were truly awful. So they had their own pick, and then they also had the rights to the Houston Rockets pick if it fell outside of the top 4. So the Thunder had high hopes. As a small market team in a non-glamorous market, rebuilding through the draft is one of their only options. And they had a good chance at 2 high picks in a loaded draft. But as it turned out, they got unlucky. Houston's pick did fall within the top 4, which meant that they kept it and OKC didn't get it. Additionally, their own pick fell all the way to 6, outside of the range for the coveted Cade Cunningham, Evan Mobley, Jalen Green sweepstakes. So they took a chance and selected the Australian point guard Josh Giddey, which ended up being a solid pick anyways. And this is the whole point. First, your chances of getting a top pick are not really that great, even if you are a terrible tanking team. You can still get unlucky. And second, you can still find success in the draft even if you're not at the top. Granted, this is a bit of a cherry-picked stat, but consider the last 5 MVPs. Nikola Jokic picked 41st, Giannis Antetokounmpo picked 15th, James Harden picked 3rd, Russell Westbrook picked 4th, and Steph Curry picked 7th. Obviously, your odds of getting a great player will always be the highest at the top of the draft. But time and time again, savvy teams have been able to find diamonds in the rough later in the draft, and meanwhile, supposed surefire picks at the top of the draft like Markelle Fultz have been massive busts. So, at the end of the day, there may never be a perfect system for drafting players. There will always be bad teams, and teams will always get lucky or unlucky if there's any chance involved with the draft. But if the NBA adopted a 3-tiered randomized draft, it would almost entirely eliminate tanking. It would still keep the general shape of the current system, but would just increase the randomness a little more. At the very least, it's worth a shot, because it's clear that the current system will continue to produce tanking as long as there is a higher incentive for being the worst of the worst. As it stands, the NBA is creating a worse TV product, non-competitive basketball, in the hopes of creating a more competitive league. Something's gotta give, otherwise, fans will continue to lose interest, especially during the regular season.